Anna Russakoff. Anna received her PhD in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. She's been teaching at the American University of Paris since 2006, where she is currently Associate Professor of Art History and Department Chair. Her main area of research is Gothic illuminated manuscripts, particularly iconography and image-text relationships. Anna's monograph, Imagining the Miraculous, Miraculous Images of the Virgin Mary in French illuminated manuscripts, was published by the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies in Toronto in 2019. She has also co-edited volumes on the illuminator Jean Poussel and on human-animal relationships in medieval France. And most recently, she has contributed a book review to Ars Judaica, which we are anticipating will be published in the next issue in just a few months. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Anna Russakoff.
Hey,
welcome.
oh, great. Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction and for this invitation. I'm very honored to be here. So thank you for having me. What I'll be talking about today, as you see the title, but Jews and blindness in medieval art. And the themes I'll be focusing on are biblical, allegorical, and actual, probably the trickiest one there at the end. So this grew out of my interest and from my monograph on images of miracles of the Virgin Mary, and then also a little side interest in disability studies. And so this is interesting for me to see how to combine them. And as far as with art history with the disabilities, I would say deafness is probably the least visible. Mobility issues would be the most visible. So wheelchairs, crutches, etc. And blindness, we'll say, would be about in the middle of the visibility spectrum, but it's surprisingly visible in medieval art. Okay, so I wanted to start out with with one biblical theme, notably the blinding of Samson, which is Judges 16:21. This was just one selection because there are plenty of references to blindness in the Bible. And so I found a particularly graphic episode from the Hebrew Bible here. From among the exploits and tribulations of Samson, the violent act of blinding stands out. So I'm starting here with the Morgan Crusader Bible, which is now in New York at the Pierpont Morgan Library. As you see, it has lots of large images. It has text in Latin, Arabic, and you see Hebrew down here at the bottom. So this is a really fascinating manuscript. We'll just have it up here at first. I'm talking about these, especially the pairing of these two different scenes. Over here, the cutting of the hair and then the blinding. So the cutting of the hair from Judges 16:17. Then opening the truth of the thing, he said to her, the razor had never come upon my head, for I am a Nazarite, that is to say, consecrated to God from my mother's womb. If my head be shaven, my strength shall depart from me. I shall become weak, shall be like other men. So Delilah eventually discovered his weakness, and she made him sleep upon her knees. And this is Judges 16:19, and lay his head on her bosom. And she called a barber and shaved his 7 locks and began to drive him away and thrust him from her, for immediately his strength departed from him. Then here the moment of the blinding, 16:21. Then the Philistines seized upon him and forthwith pulled out his eyes and led him bound in chains to Gaza, and shutting him up in prison made him blind. So these two scenes are often paired. Now this fragment here of a stained glass window, we just see this one scene of the blinding. It's from the Sainte-Chapelle. It's currently located at the Cluny Museum in Paris, but it was originally from the Sainte-Chapelle. And that will lead me to introduce King Louis IX, since I know this is a seminar for art history, but not specifically for medievalists. So King Louis IX is the only French king who ever became a saint, the Saint Louis. And any discussion of blindness in the Middle Ages must feature King Louis IX. We'll see he's going to come up quite a bit. His biographer, Guillaume de Saint-Patus, recounted that once a week, Louis would welcome the blind, often on Saturdays, would wash their feet, serve them a meal, and help them to eat. Louis is also known for his foundation in the mid-13th century of the hospital of the 15-20, which actually still exists today, although not exactly in the same location. And this hospital had 300 beds for blind people who were often accompanied by their sighted spouses. And the blind had the right to beg in the streets of Paris. We'll come back to that later. And royal support for this hospital continued well after the death of Saint Louis. Okay, so on the subject of Saint Louis, we have this wonderful psalter that belonged to him, his personal psalter. And the miniatures are actually framed by architecture that resembles the Sainte-Chapelle. And this, again, provides us with those two dramatically juxtaposed scenes: Delilah cutting Samson's hair while he sleeps, and then the Philistines depicted here with scaly outfits and multicolored winged headgear. Makes me think of Ruth Melankoff's volumes on that, gouging out his eyes while he sleeps with his mouth open and his hands bound. Okay, so texts that are inspired by the Bible are also build on this iconography. So here we see Delilah conversing up here with the Philistines in the top miniature, and now in continuous narrative in the bottom part, we have, again, the hair cutting, and then this violent scene with the blinding. And then another variation moving on now towards the later part of the 14th century. And this text, interestingly, pairs the blinding of Samson with the drunkenness of Noah. And the figures are, as you see here, they're shown in partial grisaille. So just rounding this up here by the two later examples, these are from the 15th century. We have this full scene with continuous narrative, actually 3 different narrative episodes here. And this is Jean de Vignier's French translation of Vincent de Beauvai's Speculum Historiale. So we even have Samson and the lion up here. And then again, we have the hair cutting scene and the blinding scene, which now comes with an increasing amount of gore, which continues here as well. This is another translated text here, the Speculum Humanae Salvationis, translated by Jean Mialot. And the full focus here is on this very, very violent and gory moment. Samson, we see that he's larger than all of the other figures here, but he's shown seated with his hands bound, and a focus on the eyes on this one particular act. Okay, so we've followed this one particular biblical theme. I'd like to switch over now to an allegorical theme, and this, I know I chose this one. I think I chose a replica of this one for the poster here for the talk. So this is actually the most prevalent iconography associating Jews with blindness. So it's not actually coming out of a specific biblical narrative like we saw with Samson, but rather it's an allegory that developed throughout the course of the Middle Ages, and started pretty early on. You could see, and Nina Rowe wrote a wonderful volume about this, with discovered, I think there are at least 7 Carolingian ivories. She was focusing on the monumental arts, and it really seems to have peaked in the 13th century, but it didn't end there. With these contrasting female personifications of ecclesia and synagoga. So and it's amazing how stable, on the one hand, that there are a lot of variations to it, and on the other hand, there's a certain stability to this. And there's almost always a band over Synagoga's eyes that conveys her blindness. And sometimes it even shows a translucent band. So that means that maybe she does not yet follow Christ, but maybe one day she will. So this could relate to certain passages from the New Testament, like Paul's letter to the Romans 11, verses 7 to 11, that speaks of Jews' unwillingness to see the truth. So that's, the blindfold is definitely a big part of it. Then there's also the contrast with the staffs or the standards. Ecclesia has one that's upright with a cross. Synagoga tends to have one that's broken. Ecclesia is holding the chalice almost always. Synagoga holding the tablets of the law. And ecclesia tends to be crowned, and synagoga, if she's shown with a crown, the crown tends to be falling off of her head. Just say in terms of the theme of blindness, that something like a blindfold is temporary and symbolic. It's about the easiest form of blindness to heal. So this, again, it's really different from the violent scene with gouging out the eyes that we had seen before. And on the other hand, there are many different, that tends to be the standard interpretation, that there's somehow a refusal to accept Christianity. But there are other interpretations as well of blindness. It could be, even in a Christian context, that it could be a blessing, that the physical suffering brings the blind person closer to Christ. So again, there are many different interpretations that are possible. So the Strasbourg Ecclesia and Synagoga from the South Portal may be the most famous one, but it is one of many. Just since I'm focusing a lot on France today, and the Cathedral of Notre Dame, as you probably heard, just reopened after the fire. And so 5 years later, it's finally back open again. And on the west facade, the main facade, there's also a pairing of ecclesia and synagoga. Here, both figures are shown in almost exactly the same swaying posture. But ecclesia, as typical, is crowned, holding a cross-topped standard and a chalice. And interesting, synagoga, not only is she not wearing a crown, but this blindfold is also unusual, that it's now blinded by a serpent rather than a blindfold. And again, we have the staff that's broken in two places, and then the tablets of the law up down here. Okay, I'm mostly a manuscripts person. I'll be looking mostly at those, but before we get to the manuscripts, I wanted to show a few examples in stained glass. This one is quite exceptional, and it's one of the earliest examples in stained glass because it's from the Basilica of Saint Denis, which has some of the oldest stained glass in France from the 12th century. And in this particular one, we have the figure of Christ, and we have ecclesia and synagoga. But here, synagoga is not blindfolded. There's slightly levitating. Christ places his hand on ecclesia's head, but lifts the veil off of Synagoga, revealing her with wide open eyes. And both personifications are upright, but in this case, they're barely differentiable. There are inscriptions on either side. This could also have a reference in the New Testament. Paul in 2 Corinthians, book 3, verses 15 to 16, refers to lifting a veil as a metaphor for conversion. Actually, what if on my screen, is it blocked on this side? Or can you see my full screen?
Yeah, it looks good.
It's okay. Okay, because I see you on this part of it. Okay, as long as it's working for everyone there. Okay, so at Chartres Cathedral, so we have some early 13th century stained glass. So a very typical context in which we see ecclesia and synagoga are on either side of a crucifixion. And so that's been the case throughout the Middle Ages. And here, unlike the Saint Denis glass, we see a real contrast in this one between ecclesia and synagoga. So again, ecclesia with the upright staff, crowned, haloed, this time instead of a chalice, holding a miniature church. And synagoga, which I actually can't see on my screen here, but I have it in my notes, she actually has a green blindfold, perhaps a reference to the serpent that we saw at Notre Dame, a broken red standard, her crown is removed, she has no halo, and a demon-like figure seems to be shooting at her with a bow. So we see something similar even within the same roundel at Bourges Cathedral, also from the early 13th century. On either side of the crucifixion, it's the interesting variation in this one is ecclesia not only just holding a chalice, but actually receiving Christ's blood in her chalice. So this was, at least so far with the images I've been looking at, seemed to be unusual. And synagoga get blindfolded, the crown falling off the tablets of the law and the broken staff. Okay, so when I started looking at examples of this in illuminated manuscripts, I found that the Ecclesia Synagoga allegory turned up in all kinds of different types of texts and even in ones that were quite unexpected. So some examples from the 12th century were in these really elaborate initials in Bibles. So this very complex letter I that contains a number of scenes from Genesis, from creation. We have ecclesia and synagoga down at the lower part of this initial. And I'm interested, I think it might be a little bit difficult to see it in the screen here, but they're both on top of these interesting of different figures as well. And then we start to see that the staff or the standard sometimes has a flag attached to it, and the color of that can vary. So this one we see it's kind of dark black or blue color. Okay, so we have this one as part of Genesis, and then it all can also turn up in the New Testament. So this one is the beginning of John's Gospel. And there's, again, a really elongated opening, the complex opening initial. And here, in this case, ecclesia and synagoga are in roundels. Not surprisingly, they put ecclesia on top. Synagoga is beneath, blindfolded with a broken staff. And I wanted to point this out since I'll come back to this later in my talk. What she's holding here resembles what became in the Middle Ages a very typical Jewish hat known as either by the German name, the Judenhut, or the Latin, the Pallium cornutum. So even by around the year 1150, this hat had basically become a sign for depicting of Jewish people, and we'll see this later in the talk as well, but wanted to introduce it here. Okay, so we're back to Louis IX. So Blanche of Castile is his mother, and this is a psalter I've associated with the two of them. And just to see the use of roundels, like we saw with the stained glass windows, and then the typical placement of ecclesia and synagoga near, either next to or near a crucifixion scene. So the very typical ecclesia. Now this time we'll notice that the staffs or the standards have flags on them. So she has a white flag, again with a crown, that's standard with a cross, and the chalice. Synagoga's crown falling off. This one is a particularly transparent looking blindfold, and then a green flag. So we'll see the color green has come up a few times, and then the tablets of law have already fallen from her hands. I will notice if you look carefully at this one that the synagogue is wearing a particularly vibrant blue color, even more so than ecclesia, and you only see it here with John the Evangelist. So it's like the brightest blues of the page. Okay, so you can also find these two allegorical figures in historiated initials, like in this mid 13th century missal. Ecclesia's red crown, upright staff, and chalice. Synagoga limply supporting a broken green staff, the tablet falling from her hand, and the white crown falling off. I think there's also a really interesting use of opposite colors here, with ecclesia wearing a red dress with a blue robe, and then it was the opposite for synagoga, the blue dress with the red cape. And another historiated initial here from a psalter. And this time, and again, there are always really interesting variations. It's never exactly the same thing. And these two allegorical figures seem to be interacting with each other. So there's the upright ecclesia holding a chalice with a large host inside it towards synagoga. Synagoga very obviously is twisting away and then also leaning towards her, holding the tablets of the law. It's as if she's looking right at the chalice, but can't see it since she's blindfolded. And what's very interesting about this psalter is that there are actually what seems like instructions to the illuminator down here. So I'll have to fully say, but it's about the synagoga that she's kind of, her posture is twisted, but then the holy church is standing straight. So this seems to be a note here directly for the illuminators, what they were supposed to be doing in that for the posture of the two figures in the initial. Okay, so as I mentioned before, I told you I would come back to the hat. So this here we have a historiated initial in a Bible from northern France. And not only do we have these typical figures, but we notice that often we sometimes see them with the crucifixion scene. We'll see them sometimes alone, and here it seems to be quite populated with different figures. So, for example, we have very clear on the allegory of ecclesia with a particularly large host inside the chalice. And here we have a haloed man holding an open codex. And then the figure, presumably meant to be a Jewish figure, wearing the Judenhut or the Pilium cornutum in discussion with other figures on either side of the Synagoga. And also interesting that the blindfold doesn't really seem to even be covering her eyes here. So that's an interesting variation. Okay, and just to see the variety of texts that we find this allegory in, that we even have this typical scene in a miniature in a text by a Jewish author, so Flavius Josephus, who wrote about the Jewish wars. Now, presumably the text was prepared for a Christian audience, but very interesting that this image would show up over here. So here, again, we have the what we would expect with the typical the traits of the two of them, but without additional figures now, and each of them in their own architectural niche. Okay, so another type of text in which you can find historiated initials of ecclesia and synagoga. We now start to see it even in encyclopedic texts. So we have Brunetto Latini's Livre du Trésor. So we'll be looking at two examples of those. And again, the ecclesia figure with the staff, with the white flag and the chalice, looking directly at Synagoga. Interesting, she is the one wearing the blue robe that's very much the typical color for the Virgin Mary, but very clearly blindfolded with the broken red staff and the tablets of the law over here. And another example of the same encyclopedic text, the Livre du Trésor. This time in a miniature divided into two horizontal registers. And the lower one, we have a nativity scene. And above that, we have, interestingly, ecclesia on the right, which is usually the opposite of what we see with the golden crown and a staff. This time she's the one wearing the blue dress, extending this golden chalice with a golden host towards Synagoga. Here she is wearing a pink dress, the downward facing tablet in one hand, the broken staff in the other, leaning away in the opposite direction. I just wanted to emphasize that the illuminator decided to add pink highlights to both of the cheeks, so emphasizing this femininity of both of the figures. Okay, so this is detail here from a moralized version of Ovid. And so here, just isolated miniature, the two figures by themselves against a gold background. Again, ecclesia looking towards Synagoga, wearing her crown with the chalice with the host inside. Synagoga again with the broken staff, downward facing tablet, the crown falling off of her head. But this one again, we've seen such a variety with the type of blindfolds, and this one seems you have to look very closely. It's just depicted with lines. It almost seems to be completely transparent. So get this whole question of the how temporary the blindfold is. It's really shown as something that's not permanent. And then this will be this is just a small sampling of the images that are out there. This is the last one of this particular iconography that we'll look at today. Of course, I'd be happy to come back to any of these with the question and answers. And so this is from William Durandus's text about the divine offices. Here we see miniature divided vertically with, as we see here, the divine instruction for clergymen being provided to a clergyman. And then another interesting variation on the Ecclesia Synagoga duo on the left. What I found striking about this one is that there is a rather masculine looking ecclesia with a halo and a crown, upright staff looking towards Synagoga. And Synagoga just looking so svelte here in a purple dress, holding an open tablets of the law in one hand, and coyly touching her broken staff, turning away from ecclesia, but very clearly blindfolded with an opaque cloth. And so just to end here with a quote from Nina Rowe, that the synagoga is an abstraction virtuously remaining docile within the Christian domain. And then also to bring in here, again, there are a lot of ways to look at this allegorical type of blindness. In Elisheva Revel-Neher's article, she's emphasizing that in a way, blindness could be a path towards inner vision. So we don't always have to think of it in a negative way, and it's a really open-ended type of allegorical scene. So I want to use this as a transition to look at one miracle of the Virgin Mary, the Marian image insulted, which is a French rhymed verse text of Marian miracles written by a monk, Gautier de Quincy, at the beginning of the 13th century, to see how some of these themes come together in miracle narratives. So in one of Gautier's miracles recounted here, you'll see that there's a Jew who's shown very clearly wearing the Judenhut or the Pileum cornutum that we've seen a couple of times now, sees an image of the Virgin Mary in his house and becomes very angry. And I'd like to recommend Catherine Aaron Beller's book. That's the one that I reviewed for the volume, which the whole book is about this type of theme. So he decides to throw the image into a latrine. So I'm showing well, I'll come back to this manuscripts afterwards, but it shows more of the narrative because it's in multiple scenes and compartments. Then the Jew is punished, and a Christian saves the image, and miraculous oil comes out of it. So we see the 4 different components of the narrative there. And this one, we just have one scene with throwing, that's in very poor condition, as we can see here, of the Jew throwing the image into the latrine. Okay, so a later version of this manuscript, this is from the 14th century by Jean Poussel and his entourage from around the year 1330. This is a very unique take on this miracle. So it shows a Jew throwing the Marian icon into the latrine while a Christian is actually shown in the act of blinding him. And then we see that the Jew is lying on the ground on the red outfit and is being in the stage of the punishment afterwards. But what's particularly interesting to me about this is that this act of violence and the blinding is not mentioned at all in Gautier de Quincy's text. So this is just tying in to what we've been talking about with this well-established iconography of the association of Jews with blindness. And again, to come back to Louis IX, another quote here. So Pope Innocent IV wrote about the Jews having a veil of blindness, which could relate to those synagoga images. And he wrote that letter in May 9th in 1244. And so this really augments what was already a very violent miracle narrative, but like there was no reason to put a blindness in here because it's not in the text. And so this is really just shows how on the one hand, maybe it relates to the biblical scene of a blinding, and also allegorically to this ubiquitous image of Synagoga. I mentioned that I would come back to these 13th century manuscripts. And this is so we could take a look here at the clothing of the Jews, which I hope is clear on the screen. I know I see it on my computer, but I'm not sure how it's working for everyone else. And that has to do with the badges. If we can see kind of like a golden circle here on the, you could definitely see the white. This one should be very clear. The white circle over there. So since I know this seminar is focusing on art from different periods and not necessarily just on the Middle Ages, I'll say any discussion of medieval clothing differentiation must begin with the Fourth Lateran Council. So that is on November 11th, 1215. An assembly of 412 bishops and 800 abbots and priors convened in Rome at the Church of St. John Lateran, with the Pope Innocent III presiding. And there's a famous canon, called Canon 68, from the Fourth Lateran Council that reads as follows: a difference of dress distinguishes Jews or Saracens from Christians in some provinces, but in others, a certain confusion has developed so that they are indistinguishable. Whence it sometimes happens that by mistake, Christians join with Jewish or Saracen women, and Jews or Saracens with Christian women. In order that the offense of such a damnable mixing may not spread further, under the excuse of the mistake of this kind, we decree that such persons of either sex in every Christian province and at all times are to be distinguished in public from other people by the character of their dress, seeing moreover that this was enjoined upon them by Moses himself, as we read. So although the canon began by including both Jews and Saracens, we see that towards the end it alludes to Moses, making a more specific reference to Jews. So to illustrate this miracle in these two manuscripts, we see the Jew wearing the badge, sometimes called a rhoda, shown as a circle with a blank interior. And these manuscripts are important sources since they're some of the earliest depictions of this badge. Back to King Louis IX again, he imposed the Jewish badge in 1269, and in the year 1285, it confirmed the order that Jews had to wear the round badge, known again either as the rota or the ruel, on their clothing. Okay, so now we're coming to this is the last part here. Okay, I think we're still okay with the time, about kind of the actual Jews. We're going to talk about this relationship between the Jews and the blind in medieval Paris. So this is always a tricky section because it's extremely difficult to talk about medieval illuminated manuscripts as representing any sort of reality of daily life. They were created for very wealthy and highly placed patrons, and for the most part, they were created by Christians for Christians. In other words, it is extremely unlikely that Jews, and even less likely that blind people, were able to have any control over their own representations. But there are a number of interesting parallels in the depiction of medieval Jews and blind people that I will outline here and just say that it's part of something that I'm looking into for my research. So for my first point of similarity, blind people who were beggars also wore badges in medieval Paris. So I mentioned before the hospital, the Quinze for the blind, founded by Louis IX. They had the right to beg since at least the time of King Philip IV in the streets of Paris. But starting in the year 1312, they had to wear to have the right to beg, they had to wear a yellow badge with the fleur-de-lis. But the begging was not appreciated by everyone. Blind people were also often depicted as ugly, greedy, sexually grotesque, and disabled people undeserving of charity. One of the problems was the lack of visibility of their disability and therefore the ease of falsifying it. So it was often suspected that blindness was faked in order to beg instead of work. But if there is a potential lack of visibility for blind people in real life, it was more than made up for in images where blind people become very noticeable. So in addition to the badges, which I'm still looking for, I'm sure they're out there somewhere, they also wear these very distinctive round hats. And they're also with a cane, a begging bowl, and then very often guided by a dog. So we see one example on the 14th century Hours of Jean d'Oeuvre, a very small book of hours that's now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, commissioned by King Charles IV for his young wife, Jean d'Oeuvre. And Saint Louis IX, was the great-grandfather of Jean d'Oeuvre. And there's a exceptionally large cycle of images from the life of Saint Louis that all those images emphasize his charity. And one example in this luxurious manuscript, there's a blind beggar in the margin with all of these typical attributes: a round hat, a cane, a begging bowl, and a dog. So another 14th century manuscript produced in Paris, a book of instruction for kings and princes. On folio 89R, we see a dog guiding a blind beggar holding the leash. His eyes are closed with a large round hat and a cane, and this very identifiable. Just as my last example here, that's in a secular manuscript, The Romance of Alexander, folio 77V. We have two images of a blind man with his dog, with the cane, the begging bowl, and the very round hat. And then on folio, on this upper one, 74V, with a young man leading four blind men, and everyone clings to the shoulder of the person in front of them. All four men are identifiable as blind because they wear those large round hats and canes. They don't have begging bowls in this example, and they also don't have a dog because they were lucky here to be guided by a young man. So this is a whole other scene here relating to a game about the blind men and a pig, but that's a whole other story there. So our knowledge about the daily life of the blind in the Middle Ages is necessarily limited, but these marginal images give at least an idea of how they were perceived by illuminators, and that they were recognized as important enough to be included in a variety of richly illuminated manuscripts. So whether it was to inspire pity or charity or to ridicule or denigrate them, they are nevertheless highly recognizable, and the frequency of the depictions is striking. So, okay, so just for some concluding thoughts before we can move into discussion. So both Jews and blind people were marginal groups in medieval Paris. Their presence on the streets of urban areas was often perceived as a threat. I'll say that some of these parallels, a lot of them came from Edward Wheatley's 2010 book, who wasn't focusing on the visual aspects, but he also listed some of these parallels. So both of them were forced to wear yellow badges, albeit of different shapes. And Jews and blind people are also often depicted wearing distinctive hats. Not the same one, but they both have distinctive hats. So perhaps part of the anxiety around both groups related to money, and I'd like to recommend Diane Wolfthal recently helped to curate an exhibition at the Pierpont Morgan Library about money, which is really fantastic. Both Jews and blind people accumulated wealth without physical labor, Jews through usury and blind people through begging. So this led to both groups being associated with greed. As we've seen, both Jews and blind people formed an important part of the agenda of and the iconography associated with King Louis IX. Louis IX and Blanche of Castile sought to eliminate money lending, the primary avenue of Jewish livelihood at that time. Louis IX also expelled beggars from Paris in 1254, but royally sanctioned blind mendicants or beggars at the Quinze-Vingts, that hospital, a decade later. In fact, Louis IX's hospital of the Quinze-Vingts could even be compared to a Jewish ghetto meant to segregate certain members of the population. But these comparisons only go so far, especially chronologically. Blind people, at least to my knowledge, never faced an expulsion. In France, the Jews were first expelled by King Philip Augustus in 1182 and were then readmitted with restrictions in 1198. And this was only the beginning of the trend. They were then expelled from royal territories in 1306, recalled in 1315, dismissed in 1322, recalled once more in 1359, until the expulsion became final under King Charles VI in 1394. But just to say that after 1322, so that's a certain number of the manuscripts I've showed today, there were virtually no Jews living in the royal domain of France. So from the second quarter of the 14th century onwards, then it was the biblical and allegorical representations that prevailed. Okay, well, thank you. I'm happy to move into questions now.
Thank you very much, Anna, for a fascinating presentation. It was really delightful. At this time, we'll open up the floor. So if anyone would like to ask a question, if you could just raise your hand in the React screen virtually. I see we have some distinguished guests in the audience. Okay. Until any until we get more interaction here, maybe I could ask Anna. I'm interested also in the symbolism behind the staff that the Synagoga is holding, and in some images she's holding the commandments, the tablets of the commandments, but the staff seems to be most ubiquitous. And also, if you're aware of also depictions of a blindfolded bride in medieval Jewish art that some have claimed is based on Synagoga.
Thank you for your questions. So the staff itself, from what I know, now that you asked that, I think I'll have to look into it more. But I always thought it was a way of making another differentiation between the two figures. But if there's another symbolism attached to it, I should definitely find out about that. I'm not aware about the blindfolded bride. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, Sarah Offenberg discusses it in her doctorate, and I think in some other articles. It's there's a bride and groom, and the bride is depicted as blindfolded. It could also be that Sarit Shalev Eni also discussed this theme. So it's like a case in Jewish art of sort of reappropriating the synagoga image and kind of turning it around, putting a spin on it with a Jewish from a Jewish perspective. I'll send you either articles or links to them.
Yeah, that I would be very interested.
Great. Okay, I see we have a question from Professor Shalom Sabar.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for the lecture. I have also a few questions. First of all, of what Lior told you is really the articles by Sarit Shalev I highly recommend, because she deals also with comparing the image of the blindfold Jewish woman with the Christian one. So it touches on many questions that you dealt with. What I want to remark about, there are two things. One is you said that there's no textual basis for the blindfold in the Bible, but there is, because the masveh, as it's called in Hebrew, the veil that was on Moses' face during the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, is taken in Christian theology to be the veil of the Israelites, that they could not see him, or his real face. And this is taken even in some images. I don't know from the Middle Ages, I know from later periods, from like, let's say, 17th, 18th century, where when Jews are shown, not only Synagoga, but Jews of the time are shown veiled. For example, in Margarita, der ganze jüdische Glaub, 16th century, and later some of these images, engraved images in these ethnographies on Jewish life in Germany, have these verses are cited along these images to show the veil on the face of the Jews. The other thing is, I want to ask you if you are familiar with a book of my late teacher long ago, Moshe Barash, on blindness in art. He wrote sort of a review of the blindness issue or topic in the visual arts. Like it's a big survey from antiquity in modern period, but maybe there are some other sources there. It's a book written many years ago, but still, I think.
Yes, I'm.
You saw it, okay.
Yes, I haven't seen that. I haven't looked at it, I will admit, in a while, but I've definitely know that book and have read it in the past, and I should look at that again. What I meant before about this scene, I meant that not that there are no references to it in the Bible, but it's not like a particular narrative where that is followed. It's more like an allegorical scene, and that's why we saw so many variations with it. But thank you for bringing that to my attention.
No, I mean, in the New Testament, St. Paul takes these verses from the giving of the law and makes it more general. Isn't it something that is based on this text? I don't know. I mean, I'm asking you.
I think there are a lot of different references to like lifting veils and etc. But I think the image is something that developed and kind of became its own type of allegory. But yeah, no, I think there are definitely numerous places where it came from.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think this possibility of the masveh, the veil that Moses covered his eyes so that he wouldn't see the fearful, the awesome countenance of God. That could be something, definitely something to that. But that it requires further study. Do we have any other questions or comments from anyone? Yes, Professor Ilya Rodov,
Hi.
please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Could we go back to one picture? It's Vincent de Beauvoir, blinding of Samson. No. No, I think it's second or third before the, is it this one, I think, yes, this one. No, the next. Yes, this one. Yes, I just wonder that the soldiers, that we can't see the eyes of the soldiers, so they are kind of blind, all of them. So any intention behind this?
That's an excellent observation.
About this kind of double blinding. Just think about double blind review that we know.
Right, exactly. The true double blind review. Yeah, the blind leading the blind. No, it's true. I don't even know how they could possibly see out of those helmets. Is that particular? That's a great observation.
Yes, and okay. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. By the way, about the blindness of Jewish in Jewish art, Jewish perception of blindness. So I think we have a couple of examples and visual examples and maybe some ideas in liturgy and in written sources about the blindness as a blessing. So the Jews don't want to see Jesus, so it's their choice, and the real sight, real vision is inner vision. So the Jew during the prayer should see inside, should develop his inner side, and just to close his eyes and to try draw dimensional visions in his mind. So it's another kind of blindness as a blessing. And really, Professor Moshe Barash developed this idea from the ancient Egypt until very later periods about the duality of blindness. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, that reminds me also of another Talmudic phrase for referring to blindness, which is sagi nahor in Aramaic. And that literally means abundant light. So a blind person was referred to as sagi nahor, they have abundant light. So this is typically understood as being a type of euphemism for referring to the opposite of it. And the Talmud also, there are passages in the Talmud where they discuss the issue of lashon hara, of bad speech or evil speech, that we don't want to utter negative words or discuss negative concepts. So the blindness is something viewed in a negative way. It's a handicap, it's a disability. So we wouldn't want to refer to someone as being blind, although the Bible does use word like iver, literally. But in the Talmudic nimus, the Moors, this was something to be avoided. So rather than referring to someone as disabled, a euphemism would be used to refer to them as experiencing abundant light. And I'm sure that there are interpretations that would also try to interpret this literally somehow, is that the blind actually see some kind of light or experience something, although I don't think that's the plain meaning of the Talmud. But I'm sure that there have been homiletical interpretations of these Talmudic passages that explain in this manner. Great. So, yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, Professor Miriam Reiner.
Thank
please.
you. Thank you. Thank you very much for your lecture. I have two questions. Do you know why blinds were presented with a hat? Because with a hat and a cane, they actually remind of the images of wandering Jew. So is there any connection between choice of the hat and connecting them anyway? The connection between Synagoga, Jews, and blindness, and whether the hat comes from there or some other reason for a hat? This is the first question. And the other, whether blindness was considered punishment for a sin. And if so, whether then this might be a connection with the Jews and not just the money.
Yeah, those are fantastic questions. I'm still kind of at the beginning of this project, but I'm really wondering where that hat comes from, and it's so distinctive. I hadn't even thought that was. You think that could also be a representation of
I don't know how to ask it.
The round hat. Okay, yeah, okay. So the round hat, and then the second part of your question was about whether it could be a punishment.
Considered as punishment, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of I found a lot of sources connecting it to. I mean, strangely that it sometimes related to sexuality and sexual deviance, that somehow there'd be a punishment with blindness. But yeah, absolutely, not just in terms of actual a violent act of making someone blind, but that somehow you would become blind as a punishment. So I definitely have come across sources that indicated that.
Okay, thank you.
We have the floor open for questions. More? Do we have an announcement for next week?
Yes. So maybe we can conclude the session first. You want to say last words, and then I will announce about the next session.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Anna Russakoff, for a fascinating presentation. Well, we all enjoyed it very, very much, and thanks to all of the participants in the audience and contributors. And we look forward to seeing you in the next coming weeks of the department seminar. Now more.
Okay, so again, a special thank you for your presentation, and thank you to Dr. Yacobi for leading our session today. We will meet again after Hanukkah on January 8th, 2025, when we will welcome Dr. Renata Pieczowska. But Miriam, help me with Okay, she is a guest of Professor Miriam Reiner, and she will speak about the Jewish female artists from the Young Yiddish Circle in France. An invitation will follow as usual. Until then, take care and see you after Hanukkah. Thank you.
Great. Hanukkah Sameach, everyone. Bye-bye.
Hanukkah Sameach. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you.